Friends, greetings. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. Today is May 30th, Friday. I am traditionally offering you a look at the most important news from this crazy world, which primarily concerns us, Ukrainians, and our Ukraine. Before we begin, I traditionally ask you to be active and subscribe to Channel 24 YouTube. In the description, there is my YouTube resource. And like the video and leave a comment. Your comments, suggestions, questions are welcome. Feedback from you is very important to us. We are promoting Ukrainian language content and our pro-Ukrainian position in the face of total propaganda from Russia. Vladimir Zelensky said that Moscow was deliberately disrupting the negotiation process. The United States agreed with this statement of Ukraine. Finally, Erdoğan is already telling Putin directly that he is playing with fire, and the brotherly Serbian people have stabbed Russia in the back. Let's start with Volodymyr Zelensky's statement. Russia has not provided a ceasefire memorandum, so we are witnessing another Russian deception. This was stated by Volodymyr Zelensky in his yesterday evening address. Let's quote further. He mentioned that yesterday there were talks with both the Americans and the Europeans. Everyone needs to speak honestly, and especially those who supported the ceasefire. Russia is dragging out the war and doing everything it can to deceive countries still trying to influence Moscow, not by force or pressure, but by words. Even the so-called memorandum, which they promised and supposedly spent over a week preparing, no one has seen yet. It was not passed on to Ukraine, nor to our partners. Even Turkey, as the country that hosted the first meeting, was not given the new agenda either. They do everything they can to make the meetings empty, and this is another reason why there should be sufficient sanctions, sufficient pressure on Russia, Volodymyr Zelensky said. We have already seen one memorandum from the Russians. Do you remember the Budapest Memorandum of 1994? This time, once again, we are doing everything as our partners ask. We have handed over the memorandum to the United States. Russia has not handed over anything to anyone. Russia is deliberately delaying everything. How? They will not hand over the memorandum because if they hand over this piece of paper, the United States and Ukraine will see these wild demands from Russia, on which they seem to be ready to cease fire and to stop the war. Of course, no one would go to Istanbul because there would be no point in discussing terms unrealistic to fulfill. Moreover, the Kremlin says that they will not hand over any memorandums to the United States, and they want everything to be done in a closed regime. To ensure that the meeting on June 7th in Istanbul takes place. In this way, they will show the White House that they are at a meeting and will again stall until the next meeting. If they handed over the memorandum now, everyone would refuse. There would be no meeting, there would be nothing to talk about, and the White House would draw conclusions accordingly. The President of the US, Donald Trump, is disappointed by the level of irrationality of Russia in the peace talks over Ukraine. Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, said this in an interview with ABC News. Moscow has not yet provided the Ukrainian side with the promised memorandum. This creates additional risks. Putin promised to provide his own proposals for resolving the war within a week, but neither the American nor Ukrainian sides received them. We quote Kellogg. I asked the head of the office of the President of Ukraine if he had seen this document. He said that he hadn't seen it at all. Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Rustem Umerov, also hasn't received it. Interestingly, Keith Kellogg also spoke about security guarantees. But the wildness lies in the fact that Trump's special envoy for Ukraine is talking about security guarantees for Russia, for the aggressor, not for Ukraine. The United States acknowledges the legitimacy of Russia's demands regarding the non-expansion of NATO to the east and is ready to discuss this issue as part of a peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine. Kellogg confirmed that Trump is ready to promise Putin not to expand NATO to the east if such a demand becomes a condition for ending the war. Kellogg said, "This is a completely justified concern. Russia will always raise this issue. They talk not only about Ukraine, they mention Georgia and Moldova. And we say, all right, we can discuss halting NATO's expansion to your border. This is their security interest." He also emphasized that Ukraine's NATO membership is not on the agenda, and that at least 4 NATO member countries share this position. Kellogg's quote, "We have repeatedly stated that Ukraine's NATO membership is not on our agenda, and we are not the only country saying this. I can name 4 more alliance countries that will confirm this, but all 32 countries need to agree to join." I have a question. Keith Kellogg says Russia's demands are legitimate, but there are 2 points. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, NATO's borders with Russia have increased, because Finland has become the 32nd member. Next, on June 2nd, negotiations are to take place in Istanbul. This was agreed upon, or rather proposed by Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, and this option was very welcomed in Russia, as Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said that they would very much like to meet in Istanbul. Let me remind you that Turkey is a NATO country. This is exactly the kind of terrible alliance for Russia that it is so afraid of. Therefore, it's important to clearly understand that this is just an illusion. It's an excuse invented by the Russians. NATO has expanded into Finland. That's why Kellogg doesn't say that we understand Russia's legitimate demands and Finland's withdrawal from NATO. Why are we meeting in Istanbul? This is NATO. Do you understand the absolute incompetence and the complete fabrication regarding the threat from the North Atlantic Alliance? So what does Putin want? We've talked about this many times, and the Financial Times collected it and presented it well. We have repeatedly emphasized this. Although Ukraine's leaders continue to insist on a 30-day ceasefire, many have lost their illusions that the war in Ukraine will end soon. The Financial Times writes, citing Ukrainian officials, Russia shows no signs of reducing military attacks or making real concessions. Recent talks in Turkey show that peace remains far beyond the tunnels. Russia's chief negotiator warned that they could invade and seize Ukraine's northern regions, Sumy and Kharkiv, again, according to a Ukrainian official. A few days later, during a visit to Russia's Kursk region, Russian President Putin responded favorably to a local official who said, "The neighboring Sumy region should be ours." Later, Putin announced that his forces were creating a security zone along the Ukrainian border, the term that was previously used to refer to border incursions. So Washington's hesitation to support Kyiv only emboldened the Russian dictator. After a lengthy conversation with Putin, the US president told Volodymyr Zelensky that both sides should agree on the terms of a peace deal on their own, the Financial Times adds. "We have repeatedly talked about this, that the Russian delegation made absurd demands during the first negotiations on May 15, 16. They were ready to go to Dnipropetrovsk region, to fight as long as they could. They told our delegation that some of their relatives might still die in this war. Absolute rude behavior. And why does Trump say that you should talk among yourselves? Because Putin told him in a conversation on May 19th that there are great historical reasons for this, and you don't know about them. As I've said many times before, Steve Witkoff and Trump absolutely know nothing and are amateurs in geography and history, so it's easy for them to be fed these nonsense stories. Once again, it's worth noting that Russia's attempt is to conduct the negotiation process while simultaneously advancing its offensive. Why is this so? Because the Kremlin is convinced that any contacts are a sign of weakness on the part of Ukraine and the Europeans. We have talked about this many times. Also, the Kremlin does not see the negotiation process as a meeting of equal opponents. They consider Ukraine to be non-subjective and are ready to attack, thus demonstrating to the United States, among others, that they are strengthening their position. We will speak, and at the same time we will send and shoot missiles and shaheeds at the heads of Ukrainians. Any contact with Russia, any words, as Volodymyr Zelensky said, does not work with Russia. This is an aggressor against whom only force can act, German Chancellor Merz said at a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump is being forced to impose sanctions. Trump is disappointed with Putin's unwillingness to end the war and is considering imposing new sanctions on Russia. This was reported by Reuters, citing sources in the White House. American president still hopes for the development of economic partnership with Russia, which is why he continues to avoid new sanctions, as he believes they would escalate tensions in relations with Moscow. But due to the Kremlin's intransigence on the issue of war, the US president began to think about this option. He is always looking for different ways to put pressure. He is always weighing his options. It's worth noting that CNN has already calculated that on May 28, Trump was asked by journalists whether Putin wants to fight or wants to talk about something. Trump said, "In 1 or 2 weeks we'll see." So CNN has calculated that Trump has already said 3 times about 1 or 2 weeks. He has been saying for 2 months now, 1 or 2 weeks, let's see if Putin wants peace. It's perfectly clear that Trump is running out of explanations and assurances that Moscow is willing to compromise. Moreover, they're already putting the blame on Trump. The phrase that he's always backing down has stuck to him, which makes him very angry. He's even had arguments with journalists at the White House over it. If we talk about the White House, its official statement, the White House press secretary. By the way, we'll talk about how different the statements of the White House press secretary and the State Department press secretary, headed by Marco Rubio, are. The Wall Street Journal said that Marco Rubio is also starting to put pressure on Trump to talk to Russia from a position of strength, to impose some kind of sanctions. The United States hopes that Ukraine and Russia will hold a new round of direct talks next week. This was stated by the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt. We hope that Russia and Ukraine will take part in direct talks next week in Istanbul. Keith Kellogg, the special envoy for Ukraine, also said in this interview that he would like Ukraine to be at these talks, because there is a risk that it will not go, because there is no memorandum, as was agreed upon. The pressure is on Ukraine, not Russia. There were proposals to meet in the Vatican, and Russia refused. The US said, let's look at other options. They offered Istanbul, and the US agreed. There is constant flattery and appeasement of the Kremlin. Of course, this unleashes Putin's hands, so the White House says that they are very hopeful that there will be a meeting. But what does the State Department say? They interpret it differently and say the following. US President Donald Trump judges Russian dictator Putin by his actions. Now he is extremely disappointed, because while peace talks are going on, Russia is killing civilians in Ukraine. This statement was made by State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce during a briefing. And this is the judgment that the leaders of this country will present to the leaders of the free world on whether negotiations can take place or not. And I think that in this case we will have to make decisions every minute. Here are statements. From Marco Rubio, he says, Trump is disappointed, but the White House spokeswoman said, let them meet. These are the shifted focuses. By the way, last night on May 29th, a UN Security Council meeting took place at Ukraine's initiative, following the shelling over the weekend. You remember, the horrific attacks by the Russian Federation, And for the first time, the United States condemned Russia for the shelling. His is truly unprecedented, because since Trump took office, the US has not mentioned Russian aggression at the UN at all. And you remember there was a resolution on the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and the US voted against the Ukrainian resolution, which was written by Ukraine and Europeans, condemning Russia's aggression, recognizing Ukraine as the victim. The United States proposed its own resolution, which simply mentions in 3 paragraphs that the war must be stopped. Who is the aggressor? Who is the victim? Additional sanctions against Russia are still being considered. It is in no one's interest to continue the war, said John Kelly, acting deputy permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations. Kelly's quote, "The US has put forward a proposal for an immediate, unconditional and comprehensive ceasefire. Ukraine has clearly agreed, provided Russia agrees to do the same. We have been calling on the Russian Federation to agree to a ceasefire." After President Trump and Putin's phone call, Russia was expected to provide a list of conditions that outlined its vision of a ceasefire. "We will assess the seriousness of Russia's intentions by the list of conditions, but more importantly by Russia's actions," Kelly said. In this regard, as Kelly emphasized, the United States condemns Russia's decision last weekend to launch some of the largest missile and drone strikes on Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Such disregard for human life does not demonstrate a desire for peace, and it must stop. Kelly emphasized that the alternative of continuing the war would not be in the interests of anyone, including Russia. This will continue to damage Russia's economy, military resources, national security, and international reputation. Additional sanctions against Russia are still under consideration. We can all thank Kelly. Also, acting representative from the US, Kelly, during the Security Council meeting, stated that Washington is considering the possibility of halting its participation in peace initiatives if Putin does not stop the aggression against Ukraine. Let's quote Kelly, and then we'll discuss it. "If Russia makes the wrong decision to continue this catastrophic war, the United States will have to consider the possibility of abandoning our diplomatic efforts to end this conflict." Then he says, "Just to be clear, by doing this we will not abandon our principles or our friends. Rather, we recognize Russia's refusal to cooperate with us to achieve the desired result. If we withdraw from the negotiation process because Russia does not want to end the war, it does not mean that we will not sell weapons to Ukraine. This option will remain, and it is very important." In the end, Turkey Erdoğan is telling Putin directly, "Listen, I'm tired of you." The whole world is telling, just a ceasefire, without any memorandums, root causes of the war. Just stop shooting. This was said by the head of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hakan Fidan. He was the head of intelligence in Turkey. He is a person very close to Erdoğan, and his words in fact are the words of the Turkish president. So the Turkish foreign minister said that Russia would put itself at a disadvantage to the United States if it does not show flexibility in the ceasefire against Ukraine. Fidan's quote, "Trump has a will that he established from the very beginning. I want an immediate ceasefire. At the moment, Ukraine and the European parties have shown flexibility in adapting to the US position and have accepted its terms. Now that Russia cannot demonstrate the same adaptation, Russia may find itself at a bit of a disadvantage," Hakan Fidan told reporters on his way to Kyiv. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey was on a 2-day visit to Russia, met with Putin, Lavrov. They discussed Turkey's proposal for a meeting in Istanbul on June 2nd. Lavrov said they fully agree to come to NATO and meet on the sidelines of NATO. Now Fidan has traveled to Ukraine, he stated that Russia is offering a 30-day ceasefire, after which talks can begin. We already see Turkey now saying there are conditions proposed by the US that were agreed upon by Ukraine, Europe, and all the reasonable countries of the world, but Russia is not one of them.